Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Angela Rippon. Welcome to the American College here in London. 24 years ago, in June of 1972, 5 men broke into a building in Washington that was called the Watergate Building. Now, ostensibly, they were there to burgle or to possibly even bug the offices of the Democratic National Committee. But these were no ordinary petty thieves, and this was no random target. It was a time bomb. Within 2 years, 40 high-ranking American government officials had been indicted or jailed, and the President of the United States, Richard Milhous Nixon, had resigned in disgrace, all because of Watergate, a term that came to describe not only that particular fatal break-in, but all of the covert operations, cover-ups, and illegal operations that were carried out by the Nixon administration over a 3-year period. But almost 25 years on, as they say, you ain't heard nothing yet, because there are those who believe that the scandal of Watergate itself is nothing compared to the true story of what actually happened, and indeed the cover-up to keep the lid on those lies is every bit as bad, if not worse, as the cover-up that was sanctioned by Nixon himself. Now, one of the officials who went to jail was Nixon's chief domestic advisor, a former lawyer called John Ehrlichman. This evening, in conversation with John Ehrlichman, we hope not just to revisit the story of Watergate, but also to throw new light on the events of 24 years ago and to discuss the implications for the present administration. We're also going to be meeting the author of a book exposing some of the lies behind Watergate. And indeed, towards the end of the evening, we'll also be giving an opportunity for those of you in the audience to ask questions of our guests yourself. So will you welcome, please, the man who wrote a book called Secret Agenda, Watergate, Deep Throat, and the CIA, one of our guests this evening, Mr. Jim Hogan. But will you also please welcome the man who was indeed the domestic advisor to President Richard Nixon, John Ehrlichman. John, can't we just begin by going over some of the background, because it was 24 years ago. A lot of people, even those Americans deeply involved with it at the time, will perhaps have forgotten much of the detail. You were the President's advisor on domestic issues. Before we get down to the nitty-gritty of Watergate itself, can you just establish the sort of relationship that you had with Nixon and his family, not just professionally, but also privately?
I started out as an advance man in Nixon campaigns. And in 1960, when he ran against John Kennedy, of course, he lost. I went home, practiced law in Seattle. When he got ready to run again in California in 1972, or 62, excuse me, I went to California and helped out with the scheduling of that campaign. Then in due course, his juices began to flow again in New York, and he decided to run for president once again. And a few of us who had been involved in the 1960 campaign gathered and agreed to help him run again. Well, then he won, and we all had to figure out what to do then. He invited me to go to Florida with him, along with half a dozen other people, to compose his government. And in the course of choosing up sides and figuring out who was going to be in the cabinet and so forth, he took me aside. In fact, we rode out in his car to Opa-locka Airfield to greet the losers, Humphrey and Muskie. And there was a very tearful and maudlin reunion on the runway out there when Hubert Humphrey got... Hubert was a great crier. And he got off, and he was very touched that Nixon was there to greet him. And so he shed tears and put his arms around Nixon and so forth. Well, on the drive back, Nixon said, now you've got to come and work with me in the White House. And I said, I pretty well plan to go home. He said, oh, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. We have to find a job for you. And he said, how would you like to be director of the FBI. And I said, well, you've got one of those. That was J. Edgar Hoover. Well, how about the CIA? I said, no chance. So he tried a couple of other things, and finally he said, well, I tell you what, you come in the White House and be White House counsel, be the lawyer in the White House. Work there a year, I'll make you a federal judge, and you're set up for life. So I talked to my wife about that. That sounded about the best of the various alternatives, and so I agreed to do that. Signed up for 1 year. And then, of course, 1 year led to more years, and at the end of the first term, I began to sense that it was time for me to move on. There'd been a lot of problems, but I didn't get a chance. I was ridden out of town on a rail before I had a chance to resign.
Well, we'll come to that in a moment. The fact is that essentially you were very close to Mr. Nixon personally, to his family, to his children, to his wife. There was a close personal friendship between you, as well as you actually being someone who worked for him.
Well, Richard Nixon had very few personal friends. He delineated between his staff on the one hand and personal friends on the other. And the image makers had a lot of trouble with that. They decided he needed a dog, so they got him a dog. They decided he needed a friend, so Haldeman went out and got him a friend. It happened to be a fellow that had lived next door to the Nixons in California years before and had been in Aramco and had just come back from Saudi. And they offered him a job in the White House.
Who was this?
It was a man named Johnson, and somebody that I'd never met before. So they installed him in an office over in the executive office building next door to our little building. And Haldeman went in and said, good news, Mr. Johnson is here. And Nixon said, who in the world is that? And he said, well, your friend Johnson, you know, you live next door and your wives were great. He said, I could never stand that guy. So the graft didn't take. And some of us who had been around from the old days became, of course, close to the family, especially Julie, who was very outgoing. Tricia was much more self-contained. When we first got to the White House, Tricia locked herself in her room and wouldn't come out. And that was a problem because the president wanted her to be the Azalea princess that year. And she was damned if she was going to be the Azalea princess. So it fell to me to try and lure Tricia out of her room. And I invited her to lunch, and it turned out she was on strike because the Secret Service men were following too close when she went out on dates. So we negotiated with the Secret Service, and we got an agreement that they would give her a little more interval. And but it was those kinds of family relationships. It was not friendly picnics in Rock Creek Park.
But nevertheless, it was a very close association, which is interesting when we come to see what happened 2 years down the line. But you were one of the men who was asked to set up a group called the Plumbers, euphemistically called because they were there to plug leaks from the White House. Why was it necessary for the president to have his own covert group of individuals who were operating secretly on his behalf?
It was not. Let's get that clear right at the beginning.
So why were you formed?
It wasn't formed for that purpose, and it got away from us. The president wanted 2 or 3 people to go around to the Defense Department, State Department, the agencies, and energize them to control leaks in their own entities. And 2 or 3 people were appointed to do that. Egil Krogh and David Young and I forget somebody else. And that was to be their job. We were suffering from leaks. We had battleship movements that appeared in the newspaper. We had secret negotiation plans for SALT negotiations that appeared in the newspaper and really weakened our hand badly. So the president was very exercised. We had a war on. We had a lot of protest in the country. There was a very strong political opposition. So it was a sensitive situation. These fellows were to have gone around and made sure that the departments were all doing their job. Well, they developed information that could not be ignored Excuse me just a second. And they began to take a proactive part in the plugging of leaks. For example, we discovered that a yeoman on Henry Kissinger's staff, assigned there by the Navy, was systematically going around Henry's operation and picking up papers, sensitive papers, taking them to the Xerox machine and copying them and sending them to the Chief of Naval Operations. Well, now, a lot of that was material that neither Henry nor the President wanted in the hands of the military, didn't want it really outside the White House itself. So these fellows began to get involved in how to stop this thing. And I got involved in how to stop it because it turned out that the yeoman reported to an admiral who was on the White House staff. And I had to hail that admiral in and interrogate him, a man named Wellender. This is a mansion of many rooms. It turned out that Admiral Wellender, in fact, was the commanding officer of good old Bob Woodward when he was in the Navy. So there are all kinds of little connections and interconnections that you run across in this story. Wellender freely admitted to me on tape that, and he knew he was being taped, that his boss, the Chief of Naval Operations, expected him and his yeoman to steal our papers. And they were taking stuff out of Henry's briefcase. When Haig took a trip to the Far East, the yeoman went along and he raided all of Haig's secret papers. So it became a thing by evolution, really not by plan, that this group, this anti-elite group, became proactive. And when the time came that Daniel Ellsberg stole the Pentagon papers, which ludicrously had nothing to do with the Nixon administration at all, related only to prior administrations, but was stamped with a top secret classification, the president got very exercised. Henry Kissinger got extremely exercised because Daniel Ellsberg was his protege at one point. And Ellsberg had a lot of secrets over, above, and beyond the Pentagon papers. And so the anti-elite group were turned loose to determine just how far the Daniel Ellsberg problem went. And obviously they went way too far.
When did you hear about Watergate, and how did you hear about Watergate?
I was at home. It was Father's Day weekend, and everybody in the administration was pretty much out of town. The president was in the Bahamas, the staff was in Florida. Everybody had gotten out of town except me. The Secret Service called me and said, a funny thing has just happened. They've arrested half a dozen people. They broke into the Democratic National Committee, and there's a White House connection. One of the burglars had in his possession the name of a former White House staff person, Howard Hunt. Well, Howard Hunt worked for Charles Colson, so immediately I thought, this is a Colson operation. I'd never heard of it before, didn't know it was going to happen. So I called Colson, and I said, where's your friend Hunt? And he said, oh, he's been long gone. He's working over at the Bennett Company. Well, the Bennett Company was pretty well known to be a CIA front, and Howard Hunt had once been a CIA operative, so that made sense. And I said, he's not working for you? No, Colson said, he's not working for me. I said, well, somebody broke into the DNC. And he said, I'm clean. I called Florida. I told the people in Florida what the Secret Service had told me. And then I sort of abided until Monday morning.
And what happened on Monday morning?
Well, on Monday morning, the folks were all still in Florida, not due back until Tuesday. So I assigned John Dean, who was then the White House counsel, to find out as much as he could about this episode, and particularly whether anybody in the White House had been involved, particularly whether Charles Colson had been involved in any way. And later that day, in the afternoon, there was a meeting to determine Howard Hunt's status. It turned out he still had an office in the White House. He still had a safe full of stuff. So we had a meeting to make some assignments so that people would take possession of that stuff. And at that time, Dean reported that he had talked with G. Gordon Liddy, who had been one of the burglars, and that Liddy had assured him that nobody in the White House was involved, which made me feel a little better. I was already thinking, we were only, 60, perhaps 75 days from an election, the 1972 election. I wanted to be sure that we could insulate the president from this bizarre episode. And the word I got back on Monday afternoon was that there was no connection between the White House itself and these people from the committee to re-elect.
So when did you realize that there was a connection, and what did you do about it?
Well, I didn't know there was a connection until much, much later. It was not until the following April. This took place in June. The following April, the president called me in, and he had told me to stay out of Watergate. I had enough to do, and I cheerfully stayed out of it. But in April, he said, I've been talking to Dean. I'm not satisfied with the answers I'm getting. I want you to drop whatever you're doing, take time off, and check into this for me and find out what has really happened around here. And so I began interviewing people to try and determine what the origins of this break-in were. And it turns out that there had been a series of 4 meetings back in the winter. Break-in took place in June. This is the previous winter. Meetings between John Mitchell, who then was moving in to become the chairman of the campaign, but still was Attorney General for part of that time. One of his aides, the deputy campaign director, Jeb Magruder, and John Dean from the White House. And it was at these meetings that this program formulated itself. Liddy brought proposals, brought elaborate charts. Matter of fact, he brought elaborate charts that had been prepared by the CIA. The White House had no graphic arts facility of its own, so Liddy and his friend Howard Hunt had gone to the CIA and had its graphic arts department prepare these budget charts and flow charts and all of that. Now, knowing what we know about the CIA, you can just imagine how long it took for the information that somebody in the organization was preparing operational charts for the White House that involved prostitution and surveillance and all of the things that Liddy was proposing, break-ins and so forth. How long it would take for that to get up to Dick Helm's office, the director of the CIA. Practically no time at all. So that the White House secret plans for surreptitious surveillance of the Democrats unquestionably was known to the hierarchy of the CIA before any of us in the hierarchy of the White House knew about it. But the fact is that our counsel was involved in the preparation of these plans 4 months before the break-in. And this eventually came out in the course of these interviews that I did in April.
At what point did Nixon decide that he was going to agree to a cover-up?
I think you'd have to pinpoint that on June 23rd, 1972. That would have been a week after the break-in. And that was a point where he decided to try and maneuver the CIA into position to block the FBI investigation of the Watergate break-in.
When you discovered that there was a White House involvement, did you try to dissuade the president from covering up? Did you ever say to him, Mr. President, this is illegal, we must not do it, we have to come clean?
Well, what I said was, the only way you're going to put this behind you is to get on television and make a clean breast of it. He said in response, he had a lot of reasons not to do that. But one of them was, I really don't have a total picture of what happened. This was back in February of 73. He said, I've got to have a report from somebody as to what really happened. What are all the nuances of this thing? So he packed up John Dean and sent him to Camp David to sit up there and write the president the comprehensive report that would permit the president to go public on the thing. Well, Dean realized as he was writing that out, I'm sure, that he was writing his own confession. And so he did the thing that any red-blooded American boy would do. He called his lawyer. And his lawyer began negotiating with the U.S. attorney for John Dean to receive immunity or some form of leniency in return for informing on a group of low-level White House and campaign people. And then that progressed through late March and through April, with Dean upping the ante however it was necessary to do it to secure the favor of the prosecuting attorneys. This is some of the material that just now is becoming available to us. And we're involved now in the preparation of a documentary on this subject because there's all this wonderful stuff that's coming to hand now. The Special Prosecutor's Archives are opened up for the first time. And you can trace day by day the way the prosecutors ratcheted Dean up, first from low-level minions like Gordon Strachan, and then up to Jeb Magruder, and then up from there to Haldeman and me, and finally up to the president himself. And it was over a period of 4 or 5 weeks that this negotiation went on.
While you were investigating, you clearly realized that any kind of cover-up would be illegal and presumably against the president's best interests. Did you tell him this? Did you try and persuade him to come clean?
Yes, and I'm glad there is a taping system, because I will be heard on any number of occasions urging him to step out and make a clean breast of things.
What do you think was his state of mind at the time? Why was he refusing to take your advice? Was he just trying to save his own skin, believing, as you say, that he was genuinely above the law? And was he really not caring what happened to the rest of his staff?
His frame of mind changed over a period of time. From February, when he came off really a triumphant State of the Union and inauguration and so on through April, he steadily began realizing the full extent of his difficulty. And as that went on, he lost more and more of his good political instincts. And finally, just before I left, which was the last day of April, he didn't know from one day to the next what was true. He would say something one day, the next day he would ask you whether in fact that had occurred or not. And another day he wasn't even sure of those two things. So I saw him pass through any number of versions of the truth during that period of time.
When did you realize the net was closing in on you?
The president called Haldeman and me in one day in April to say that the assistant attorney general had been over to see him, to say that Dean had been treating with the prosecutor and was trying to negotiate a plea bargain, and that some of the allegations he was making against me were extremely serious.
Which included?
Which included the allegation that I had ordered Howard Hunt to flee the country so that he would not be an available witness. That I had instructed John Dean to destroy the contents of Howard Hunt's safe once they had been recovered.
Did it also include that you had given papers to the FBI for them to destroy so that the CIA couldn't get them?
No, that's one he overlooked.
But that is one of the accusations that was leveled against you.
Well, the whole thing about destroying papers involved giving some of the papers to the director of the FBI, so that the investigating agents of the FBI would not get those papers.
So, in fact, you were involved, even though you were not involved in Watergate itself, you admit to being involved in the cover-up?
No, not in that instance. I'm telling you what the allegations were. It happens that these very serious allegations that were leveled against me, I knew were not true. But I was in the position of having to try and prove a negative against somebody who had a very strong motive for trying to tie me in. And the business about sending Howard Hunt out of the country turned out to be John Dean ordering Howard Hunt to go out of the country. And then when challenged on it, saying, oh, well, Ehrlichman told me to do it, which hadn't happened. The business about the destruction of documents the same way. It turns out Dean destroyed documents and then tried to blame me for telling him to do that, which didn't happen. As a matter of fact, the things that forced my resignation were all disproved in the succeeding months. The thing that hooked me and that got me 18 months in jail was that business of the Beverly Hills Police Department. And if I had it to do over again, I might do it differently, because that obstruction of justice charge popped up not only in one set of accusations that were tried, but then popped up in the Watergate case itself.
Do you believe that at the time the president could have saved you, that he could have done more to ensure that you didn't go to jail?
Oh, sure, he could have pardoned me. That's a time-tested technique.
And that, could he have protected you?
No, I don't think so. He was in the process of throwing babies out of the sleigh to try and slow the wolves down. And
you're saying that he sacrificed you to protect himself?
we were in that category. And I doubt seriously that there were any realistic alternatives at that point. We're talking now about April of 1973. It was too hot and heavy at that point. The Washington Post had the wind up. CBS had the wind up. There was a new headline every day. I was accused of funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars to Robert Vesco one day in the LA Times. Perfectly nonsense, total nonsense. But I became a fair target for all kinds of accusations.
So you say you were sacrificed. Do you feel bitter towards the president, someone who had been a fairly close personal associate?
I was bitter at one time. The day he fired me, I was called to Camp David and went over to his cabin. He came in and he'd been crying. It was obvious. And he said he just had prayed the night before that he wouldn't wake up that Sunday because he didn't want to have to fire Bob Haldeman and me. I said, well, and it was very touchy. I became very emotional. He was very emotional. I said, sometime I would like you to explain to my kids why you're doing this. Because, frankly, I can't. I don't understand it. The things that I've been accused of were not true, and I felt it was a terrible injustice. I carried that sense of things with me into jail. I had 18 months to think about it. By the time I came out of jail, that self-pity had fallen away pretty well, and it has not revisited since.
At any time, did you feel that there was, as it were, a fifth column at work, that it wasn't just what you were doing, what the plumbers were doing, what was involved in the Watergate break-in, but that there was perhaps another hand manipulating what was happening?
Well, I think now we see, and I've talked to Haugen and others about this, that the intelligence gods in Washington gave this thing a very significant nudge at various times. As you get into the whole Watergate story, you stumble over the CIA at every turn. The burglars, a majority of them were CIA employees. Their lawyers, some of them were CIA operatives, and we knew that. People like Paul O'Brien, who appeared to defend some of the burglars. One episode after another in the ensuing years, I was accused of having arranged for Howard Hunt to get disguises and credentials and various kinds of help from the CIA. The deputy director of the CIA tagged me as the person who had phoned him to tell him to give Howard Hunt these things. Didn't happen. As a matter of fact, that man, that deputy director, and Howard Hunt had shared an office together for a number of years when they both worked for the CIA. I think what happened was that he extended these courtesies to Hunt, and then the balloon went up. Somebody said, why is the CIA involved in these domestic operations against the law? And Cushman started looking around for somebody to point at. And his first excuse was, well, somebody in the White House asked me to do it. I forget who it was. It was one of 2 or 3 guys. And then finally he said, I think it was Ehrlichman. So I called the director of the CIA in, and I said, this guy's made this accusation, and it is not so. Well, it was a matter of days, and then a matter of weeks, and then a matter of months, when all kinds of evidence appeared that I was the person that had called Cushman. There were memoranda. There were minutes of meetings. There were recollections, statements taken from different people. The CIA machine was cranking out, as it is known to do, all kinds of files, file material to prove that I was the guy that had called to have Howard Hunt taken care of. Out of whole cloth. But it's what that agency can do when it wants to.
You are saying that the CIA nudged everything that happened with Watergate, with everything in that generic term of Watergate, to ensure that it worked out the way that they wanted it to, beyond anything that you or the plumbers or anybody else may have planned?
Oh, I think so. And you can look at just the break-in itself. It's as if somebody had picked up the phone and said to McCord, who was kind of the leader of the break-in operation, make sure that this thing fails. And he did a beautiful job of making sure. You read Jim's book, and it's extraordinary the lengths to which McCord went to make sure that it would go awry. And then the cops were called. Somebody called the cops before the burglars ever even got into the Democratic National Committee headquarters. They were just in the process of making their entry when the Metropolitan Police walked in. So somebody had set that thing up for failure way back when, and my nominee is the CIA.
Jim, your book, as we say, is called Secret Agenda. Why were you so suspicious that the Watergate, the official line on Watergate, is not the whole truth, that there is another agenda behind this?
Well, I got into the Watergate story belatedly and sort of reluctantly. I wanted to write a personality piece about a private investigator in Washington named Lou Russell, who was a Cold Warrior back in the 50s. He'd been the chief investigator for the House Committee on Un-American Activities, and had since led a very dissolute and depressing life and was sort of a Raymond Chandler kind of character. And so I wanted to do this interesting story about him. But there was a problem with it, and the problem was that there were rumors about Lou Russell that made him too interesting, and those rumors were to the effect that he worked for James McCord, who led the break-in team at Watergate, and that he'd been present during the Watergate break-in. Now, if that was true, it just made the story entirely different than the one I had imagined doing. It made it a news story because there was supposed to have been a 6th man who escaped from the Watergate that evening when the 5 others were arrested. I thought naively that all I had to do was go to the Urban Committee transcripts, etc., and look at the news reports, and it would become pretty clear that Russell had nothing to do with it, and I'd get on with my piece. To my surprise, I found that the Watergate break-in had not, in fact, been investigated by anybody. And the reason for that was simply that on about 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning on June 17th, a Saturday, these guys were caught red-handed inside the Democratic National Committee. They had surgical gloves, they had electronic eavesdropping equipment, and they had miniature cameras. So it was obvious what they were going to do. They were in the opposition's political headquarters. They were obviously after some sort of political intelligence. The job for the press at that point became to determine how high up the chain of the ladder of responsibility in the White House they could go to see who'd ordered this. The job for the prosecutors were to convict these guys. As a consequence of this, no one actually looked in any forensic way at the break-in to see how it had gone down that night, or indeed on the 3 prior occasions when they had attempted to break into the DNC and supposedly failed. As I looked at this, one thing jumped out, and that is that over the summer, a man named Alfred Baldwin, who was a former FBI agent and who worked for Jim McCord, came forward and, in return for immunity, offered to testify to the fact that he had been in the Howard Johnson's motel across from the Watergate, and that he had monitored telephone conversations at McCord's direction for a period of 3 weeks. And he'd made notes on a yellow legal pad and passed them to McCord, and McCord had done whatever he'd done with them. Well, that was fine and interesting. The problem was that the FBI and the Chesapeake Potomac Telephone Company had repeatedly searched the DNC, both before and after the break-in. On the 15th, they'd gone on a search at the request of the DNC itself. Then they'd done so again on the 18th and subsequently. No electronic eavesdropping devices were found. There then ensued a correspondence between the U.S., an intemperate correspondence between the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI, saying in effect that you have really screwed up and you're about to screw up the most important political case we've ever had. The FBI's response in general was, we're sorry this compromises your case. There's nothing we can do about it. We'll go back in and look again, as indeed they did at least twice afterwards. Did not find any bugging devices. So this is a huge and fundamental contradiction in the Watergate story. No one ever doubted that Alfred Baldwin was telling the truth. He certainly was. He did work for McCord. He did hear phone conversations. But what can we conclude from this? I think there are only 2 reasonable possibilities. The first is ludicrous, that McCord and the others broke into the DNC to debug the place. That did not happen. The second possibility is, and this is what I believe did happen, that Baldwin was listening to an eavesdropping device that was in another place, that it was not inside the DNC as McCord had told him it was, but was in another location. Now the question then becomes where? And the answer has to do with the nature of the conversations that Alfred Baldwin heard. Those conversations were not political, they were sexual. Almost all the conversations Baldwin told the U.S. Attorney's Office were between what he believed were secretaries at the DNC and their boyfriends, making dates for that evening, whichever evening it was, and speaking explicitly about what they were going to do that night in a sexual way. Baldwin's a very interesting guy, and this seemed plausible to him that secretaries might in seriatim talk this way. The U.S. Attorney's Office did not know what to make of it. And in the end, all of this was buried. And I think that if one pays attention to this and really follows out what this has to do with Watergate, why they were interested in these conversations, why James McCord pretended to bug the DNC, when unquestionably he did not, you come up with an entirely different story about Watergate.
And that story is what? That story is sexually based, are you saying?
I think it has a lot to do with sex, certainly. We know what Baldwin heard. We know what he claims to have heard. We know what James McCord did on that evening, or the evenings when McCord broke into the DNC and the others broke into the DNC. McCord repeatedly lied to his colleagues. We know also, according to Alfred Baldwin, in his interview with the Los Angeles Times, that McCord, in fact, was able to go in and out of the Democratic National Committee with impunity. He was repeatedly seen inside the DNC. This is not entirely surprising because on the night of the arrests, one of the Cubans became alarmed because he lost McCord. He couldn't find him. And he went looking around in the building for him and climbed up to the 8th floor where the Federal Reserve Board was. And there he found McCord talking to the building guards, who obviously knew him. It's interesting that when McCord broke into the DNC, he didn't just tape the doors to the 6th floor. He taped the doors on 6 different floors. And not only taped them once, but once the guard had actually discovered the tapes and removed them, he, McCord, then replaced them so that they could be found a second time. And I don't think there's any doubt between.
What were they looking for? What are you saying they were looking for?
What was McCord looking for?
Yes.
What were the others looking for? Well, the question, I think, really is, why did McCord lie? Why did he refuse to bug the people that he had been detailed to bug? He had one assignment, essentially, and that was to bug Larry O'Brien, who was the chairman of the Democratic National Committee. For reasons that are unclear, McCord chose Spencer Oliver, who was chairman of the Association of Democratic State Chairmen, as a target of opportunity. McCord has since claimed that a bug was found on O'Brien's phone. The FBI says, no, we never did. We searched there, and there was never anything there. Larry O'Brien was a very important person to Jim McCord, and it had nothing to do with the politics of the White House. Larry O'Brien had previously been the Washington representative of the Howard Hughes organization. And James McCord's previous job, you should know, was as the director of physical and technical security for the CIA. Now, in that position, it was McCord's responsibility essentially to protect all CIA operations in the world. That includes the personnel, the assets, and the physical plant, as well as the information. This is relevant where Larry O'Brien is concerned, because the Howard Hughes organization was at that time negotiating with the CIA in Washington for what amounted to the largest capital-intensive CIA operation of that time, and that was the Glomar Explorer project to recover a sunken Soviet submarine. McCord, who the counterintelligence director of the CIA once told me never did anything unless he was wrapped in a flag, had been sent over there to bug O'Brien. McCord knew that if he refused to bug O'Brien, they'd find somebody else to do it. If he did bug O'Brien, that information would presumably get back to the White House, and it would be inevitable, because the White House is such a sieve, as you know better than anybody, that this operation would eventually be compromised. And so McCord sabotaged the operation because it was the only way to prevent that operation from being compromised, and he felt, wrongly as it turned out, that it was an operation of immense importance.
So we're talking about someone else's commercial interests being protected and another person entirely being jeopardized.
We're talking about the interests of the CIA being protected by McCord. My book is called Secret Agenda. It should properly be called Secret Agendas, because I think different people in the Watergate operation all had their own agenda. McCord's agenda, very simply stated, was to protect the agency and to protect this particular operation from exposure. I think that Gordon Liddy's agenda was to do what he had been told, to be the good soldier. He believed that John Mitchell issued the order to bug O'Brien and to photograph documents there, and he went ahead to do that. Howard Hunt's agenda is more interesting. It's 25 years later, and people are still asking, what was the purpose of this break-in? Why did they go into the DNC? People say, well, political intelligence. Well, what political intelligence? The Democratic National Committee was essentially a ceremonial institution. The target himself, Larry O'Brien, had moved to Florida weeks before, so he wasn't even in the office that was supposed to be bugged. This was known to the people who'd sent him.
Jim, you're still getting away from the issue. You've made the accusation that there was sex at the bottom of this. What the heck has a submarine got to do with sex?
Well, do they have sex on submarines? I don't know.
That's not for us to discuss.
I am getting to that, and that has to do with what the only evidence is as to what the specific target of the Watergate break-in was. And that evidence consists of a key, which was wrestled from one of the Cubans, Rolando Martinez, by the arresting officer, Carl Schaffler. Schaffler didn't understand the significance of this key. The FBI subsequently took it around through the DNC, tried it in every filing cabinet and every desk, determined that this key fit the desk to Ida Maxey Wells, who was the secretary to Spencer Oliver, who, as I said, was the chairman of the Association of Democratic State Chairmen. Ms. Wells controlled access to a telephone. That telephone was used by visiting Democratic politicians who would come to Washington to make dates with a woman who used the name Kathy Dieter, who was at the Columbia Plaza Apartments a block away from the Watergate and in line of sight of both the Howard Johnsons and the Watergate. The politicians would be sent to this office, which was basically unused, and they would be told to wait and telephone would ring twice. They were not to answer it. After a pause, the phone would ring again, and the woman would get on the line. The politician would then be shown the photograph of the woman, and they could make whatever arrangements they wanted to make for that particular evening.
They were running a call girl operation.
Yes, in a word. And that's where the sexual connection comes in, and it's to those conversations that Alfred Baldwin was in fact listening.
And there was a book in the drawer which held everybody's name and address and telephone number.
I don't know what the drawer held. That's speculation, but we must suppose that it did, because that, or at least that's what Hunt and the others believed.
Let me just ask you this, both of you. You are convinced that the CIA was behind what actually happened with Watergate. We're not denying that Nixon was involved in a cover-up and that there were people on Nixon staffs who actually perpetrated Watergate and all of those things that are involved with it. Nixon then tried to cover up. But you are saying, both of you, that the CIA was actually actively involved in ensuring that this progressed in such a way that it ultimately brought down the President of the United States.
I think the CIA, and Richard Helms in particular, took advantage of this. There's no question that it did. Howard Hunt was reporting to the CIA throughout his tenure at the White House and at the Mullen Company, and not just casually reporting. He was using an CIA officer who worked at the White House named Rob Roy Ratliff to report on a weekly basis. He was sending him packages that were supposed to be 2 inches thick, containing gossip, which was used in part apparently for psychological profiles that were being made at the agency of different individuals.
Why did the CIA want to bring down Nixon?
When we talk about the CIA, I can tell you why James McCord wanted to bring down Richard Nixon. James McCord is an extension of the CIA. McCord, during the summer of, or in December 1972, sent a letter to the White House through Jack Caulfield, and it was to go to Richard Nixon. And he said that if Richard Helms, the then CIA director, was removed from office, every tree in the forest will burn. And by that he meant he would bring down the government. That letter was supposed to be delivered to Nixon. Instead, it went to John Dean. Dean read it and sent back a reply that was totally irrelevant, which was to the effect, your expenses will be paid. That's not what was concerning James McCord. McCord was determined that the Central Intelligence Agency would not be diminished by having Richard Helms removed. And in fact, Richard Helms was removed a week later, appointed ambassador to Iran, and soon thereafterwards, every tree in the forest did burn. And when we talk about the CIA's interest in all this, the problem is that the agency is not a monolith. The agency has factions within it. Different players have different concerns. They were very concerned about Henry Kissinger's determination to diminish the agency's importance in Washington by disregarding or minimizing the importance of the national intelligence estimates that the CIA produces, and which really constitute its raison d'etre.
There was also a suggestion, I believe, that the CIA thought that Kissinger was himself a Soviet spy.
Yeah, it's more than a suggestion. The counterintelligence chief of the CIA, James Angleton, longtime counterintelligence chief, over 25 years, I believe, stated that Kissinger is objectively a Soviet agent. And
codenamed Bohr.
He used the name Colonel Bohr, and this information was originated by a man named Michael Goleniewski, who was a Polish intelligence officer who defected to the United States and whom the New York Times has described as, quote, the single most important defector in the history of the CIA. Now, this is not to say that Henry Kissinger was a Soviet agent. It's just to say that James Angleton believed he was. Angleton held a great many eccentric opinions. This may well have been one of them. I believe it was. Having said that, he wasn't alone in this view. There were ultra-conservative elements in the intelligence and military community that were persuaded of Angleton or of Kissinger's disloyalty Admiral Emil Zumwalt, who was Chief of Naval Operations during part of this period, made the same statement. He said that Kissinger and Nixon are secretly convinced of the inevitability of the Soviet system's victory in the Cold War, and so are effectively selling out the United States in an effort to make the best deal.
So this could be a reason why the CIA wanted to get rid of Nixon and with him Kissinger. 25 years on, does it matter?
Yeah, it really does matter, because if you don't believe in history, if you don't care about history, then you really don't care about government. And if you don't care about government, you're in trouble. So, and there's no statute of limitations on the truth. I think it's historically important, and we need to get at it. Not in terms of the headlines it generates, but simply to understand our own past, because otherwise we don't have an informed electorate. I could get off on this, because I think that with the rise of the intelligence communities, one of the things that's happened is that our history has in effect been encrypted. We know less and less about it. And I'm not sure that that's at all compatible with a true democracy.
John, let me ask you, if the CIA were indeed involved in helping to bring about the downfall of Richard Nixon, was history changed as a result of that? Would it have been better if Nixon had been left in office?
Well, I think unquestionably history was changed. If Nixon had survived his full term, I think the chances are very good that Nixon's choice of a successor would not have been Ronald Reagan. It would have been John Connally. John Connally might have won, might not have won. Clearly, we wouldn't have had Jerry Ford in there in between. You'd take off on a path that is, if not contrary, certainly materially different than what we've experienced.
And if the CIA had such a massive influence, as you are both suggesting, on what was happening within the White House, what does that tell us about the present administration, what is happening at the moment in the White House with President Clinton? Is the CIA still effectively a fifth column that is running American politics?
I talked to a man a couple of weeks ago who had served in the national security apparatus. He's not in government now. He said, we created any number of client governments around the world. In South Korea, Guatemala, and a number of places. The United States brought down regimes and installed friendly regimes. He said that was our mode of doing business in those days. And none of us were capable of drawing the line and saying, well, that's a foreign situation and this is a domestic situation. We all knew how we could do the domestic thing better than the people in the White House were doing it. And we were in the mode of bringing down governments. So he says it's a very small slip for me to hop from bringing down the president of Guatemala to affecting the occupant of the White House.
And are they still doing that?
Oh, I haven't any idea. But it stands to reason that the CIA is still a very, very powerful piece of machinery in the government.
And are we likely to see it therefore having an effect on the presidency of the president incumbent, Clinton?
Well, I think his bigger worry is the special prosecutor, not the CIA. It seems to me that this particular administration, while well ahead in the polls and probably on its way to being reelected, has got to worry about its near future in terms of its ability to withstand indictments and what goes with it. So it's quite a different context. Actually, the CIA in our administration didn't get together and say, okay, fellas, let's figure out how we're going to get rid of Richard Nixon. I think it was much more a proposition of their getting together in the morning and saying, you will never guess what those guys did yesterday. Now, if we just give it a little nudge, if we just give it the hip tomorrow, we can help on the slippery slope. And goodness knows it was a joint effort. I think the White House itself created a number of the opportunities that Helms and the other boys just took advantage of. One thing that Jim mentioned that's interesting, we're doing this documentary which will probably be out next summer time for the 25th anniversary of all of this. Jack Barnett, who's the patron saint of the American College, is the patron saint of the documentary as well, and he's given us a tremendous amount of backing on it. One of the things we discovered is that these notes that Baldwin took of the overhears of these sexual liaisons and so on are in existence, but they're under court seal in the District of Columbia. The Democrats ran to a judge and got him to impress them with the sanctity of a court seal. Well, it appeals to us that after 25 years, we ought to take a look at those and see just who was involved and what was going on. And as journalists, it's perfectly legitimate for documentarians to come forward and ask the court to lift that seal. So that's one of the things that we're about, along with the interview of a great many people who were involved in the review of this countless thousands of pages of depositions that are flowing out of this lawsuit, and the new archives that have opened up. The whole Special Prosecutor's Archive is now available to us. And it's fascinating to see how they knew, what they knew, and how little of it they shared with the defendants in those cases.
John, thank you for sharing your memories of Watergate with us, and Jim also. There are many people in the audience, I'm sure, that would like to ask both of you questions. We have some roving mics. Who has a question first for Mr. Ehrlichman?
Alexander Butterfield was a fellow that Bob Haldeman and I were in college with. And he went into the Air Force, became a military attaché in foreign embassies, and almost surely had an espionage role. He's the fellow who disclosed for the first time the taping system in the White House to the public. He was in charge of the operation of that taping system. He had the office right next to the president. And he was the fellow that carried papers in and carried papers out and kind of facilitated the flow in the president's office. Bob Haldeman and I used to talk on the phone long after we had gotten out of jail and started writing books and doing whatever. He was making money and I was writing books. And he had expressed to me on several occasions his concern that Butterfield retained some connection to the CIA all the time he was working in the White House. Now, I've seen Butterfield a few times since. He denies any such connection. It's up for grabs as far as I'm concerned. I'm not sure. I'll tell you my deep throat story. That's all I can do. There's an investigative reporter named Cy Hirsch from the New York Times. Cy Hirsch and Woodward and Bernstein and I all have the same publisher. And our editors sit cheek and jowl with one another. Cy has told me that the first draft of All the President's Men didn't have Deep Throat in it. And Alice Mayhew, who's the editor at Simon & Schuster, who has edited the boys' books, handed it back to them and said, fellows, this book has got to have a Megillah. It's got to have a gimmick. And this book doesn't have it. And so they went away to the mountaintop and they came back and lo, in the second draft, there was Deep Throat.
If I can interject something about that, there's a memo from a CIA officer named Martin Lukowski, which talks about a man named William Bennett making a backdoor entry to the Washington Post through their attorney's office, Edward Bennett Williams, and, quote, feeding Bob Woodward stories about Watergate, for which Woodward is suitably grateful, and in return for which Woodward is keeping the CIA out of his stories. That goes to the question that you raised. It's also the case, if you read All the President's Men, it gets very interesting. Throat talks about this, that, and all this political stuff, and then late in the book, he has a really interesting meeting with Bob Woodward, in which he says, the CIA is all over this case. People's lives are in danger. People are being wiretapped in Washington. It's a disaster. None of that actually gets reported in the Post. It only appears in All the President's Men. So it would appear that there was some sort of accommodation, at least, between the intelligence community and at least a part of the press at that time. Well, I think it goes to the the whole issue about the agency that I mentioned earlier being a monolith. It's not a monolith, but there are certain things that it agreed upon with people in the White House and certain things it disagreed upon. The agency, ran Operation Chaos, which really attempted to shut down the anti-war movement and led to all kinds of things. And in that, they were in agreement. James Angleton, who is a key historical figure, was of the opinion, of a lot of very strange opinions, that, for example, the anti-war movement was being run out of Moscow. He was also of the opinion that the Sino-Soviet split was a fraud designed to deceive us. And so when he sees Henry Kissinger go to China secretly and do so in such a way that the agency is not informed ahead of time, he becomes alarmed. So sorting out the internal nuances of the agency is very, very difficult, especially because so many of the people in the agency won't discuss it.
I think from my vantage point, I would have to say there was very little affinity or cooperation between the presidency and the CIA. The president was continually complaining to anybody that would listen about the rotten job that the CIA was doing for him and bringing intelligence to him. He sent me one time to Dick Helm's office, the director, Central Intelligence, to request the files on the Bay of Pigs. Now, the Bay of Pigs is a closed episode, but very embarrassing to the CIA, and particularly to Helms and some of his crowd. Helms said to me, well, I couldn't possibly turn them over to you. I would have to have a personal request from the president himself. So I said, okay, I'll arrange an appointment for you, which I did in the next couple of days. And Helms came over, and he and the president sat down, and I said, this is the purpose of the meeting. The president said, yes, I want these files. Helms said, Mr. President, that's simply not possible.
So the CIA simply refused to make material available to the President of the United States.
Right.
What did Nixon do?
He kicked the furniture quite a lot. and it wasn't too long before he bounced Helms, sent him off to Iran, sent Jim Schlesinger in as director of the CIA with orders to knock it down, fire a lot of people, shake it up, reorganize it. And Schlesinger only lasted, 4 months over there, something of that kind, and then he got out and went to the Defense Department. It's very much a close corporation. There undoubtedly was a time, and I suspect it was right after the '72 election, when I could have walked in and said, Mr. President, either you make a full disclosure of what's been going on around here, or I will. I'll resign and go out and have the damnedest press conference you ever heard. I was convinced at that time that that was the pregnant moment. He had huge plurality. American people were very much with him. It was the time. I think if I had done that, and if I had forced the issue in that way, he might have survived.
Why did you not do it then?
I was a coward.
It was easier just to follow his line.
Well, you either do that and you leave because there's nothing there for you anymore, or you stay and you work within the system, as they say. And it was at a time when I had told the president I was leaving. In due course, I'd agreed to stay on for 6 or 8 more months, handle a couple of projects that I very much cared about, and somebody else was going to take over the heavy lifting in my department. So I was kind of on the wane at that point anyway. And I didn't foresee all the trouble that was down the road. It was a kind of an instinct, much more than it was a fear of what lay ahead. But looking back on it in the terms of reference that your question involves, I think that was the time when I might have done something that would have changed history, it would have changed the president's career. That was a friendly usage that Haldeman and I had to refer to our employer. We had other terms of endearment as well. Haldeman used to call him Rufus. He used to call him Amos. He called Mrs. Nixon Thelma all the time, because we knew who he was talking about. But there were times when Nixon had either the appearance or the demeanor of a mad monk. He was given to extravagances that were Rasputin-like in the sense of the film about Rasputin. And after you'd worked with him for a long time, you realized that a lot of what he was saying he didn't intend. And it was like the Queen of Hearts, and it was off with their heads. And you didn't rush out and start chopping heads off. You waited a decent interval. And then the next day or so, he would say, "What did you do about that?" And you say, "Well, I didn't do anything." And he said, "Well, that's good, because I've changed my mind." He decided to cut off all federal money to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology one day. And he was mad at Jerome Wiesner, who was the provost or the president or whatever. And it was a dispute over funding of the ABM, the ballistic missile. So he called George Shultz and me in. Shultz had taught at MIT at one time. He said, "All right, I want you guys to cut them off. Cut them off today. They get no more money. I don't want to hear about them getting any more money tomorrow." And so we went out on the hall, and Shultz says, "My God, that's terrible. They've got experiments going on and marvelous scientific breakthroughs. And so what are you going to do?" And I said, "I'm not going to do anything. He'll get over it." And so we went back to our offices, and sure enough, day after tomorrow, we came back. He said, "What'd you do about Wiesner?" I said, "Nothing." He said, "Well, that's just as well. I don't think we can get away with that." So you had to kind of be in the rhythm of the place, and there was some pretty odd stuff that went on around there. As far as the enemies list is concerned, I worked there every day. I didn't know there was an enemies list. Never heard of it. That was something that was generated out of a conversation that Richard Nixon had with John Dean. And instead of Dean kind of abiding a set of instructions, which Nixon probably didn't really mean, Dean went charging out and started putting together a list. There was another list that nobody talks about, and that was a press list. Nixon had the press secretary and Herb Klein develop a list of friendly press and unfriendly press. I saw that. And that described the offenses committed by Dan Rather and others in the unfriendly list, and it had a much shorter list of friendly people. And that became usage. That really was put into practice. I received a set of instructions that I was not to see or interview anybody on the unfriendly press list. I had to get specific permission to interview Hugh Sidey or one of the unfriendlies. And that was more in the breach than the observance. I went ahead and interviewed the people that I wanted to interview, but every once in a while I would get an inquiry from the press office saying, "Did you see John Osborne?" "Yes, I saw John Osborne." "Well, you weren't supposed to. He's on the list." And so there was a little bit of pressure that way. I would say that Richard Nixon lived his life with lists like that. He knew who his friends were. He knew who his enemies were in the press. He knew who his enemies were in the Congress. And he kept a little list, as the saying goes, perhaps not on a piece of paper, but in his mind. And he had his friends and he had his enemies all through his life. It's a tough way to lead a life. Richard Nixon was one of the least interesting social companions I ever had. He wanted to talk about the subjects he wanted to talk about to the exclusion of all else. And his range of interest in life was about this wide. I vividly recall standing up to here in the crystal blue waters of the Bahamas with him, just the two of us, with a ring of Secret Service men arranged out to keep the sharks away. And the little silver fish were swimming between our legs, and the sun was shining, and he wanted to talk about the politics of suburban Cleveland. And that's what we talked about.
You might also share with us his favorite films, which also, I think, gives an interesting insight on the president.
Well, we would go to Camp David. Occasionally, the staff would be invited, or a couple of us, to share a movie with him. And the Navy ran Camp David, and they had all these films that you could get, the latest films. He showed over and over again Around the World in 80 Days, and Patton, and something else. I forgot what the other one was. But
Sound of Music.
Sound of Music, yeah. And then he played over and over again the soundtrack from Victory at Sea, which was kind of the level of his musical interest. I had a friend who was a lawyer in Washington, a wonderful guy with a great big beard, who would go to Washington parties. And if the subject being discussed around the table was not of particular interest to him, Ira would get up and go upstairs and find a bedroom and go to sleep. And then his date would come and wake him up when it was time to go home. Richard Nixon, in a social situation, was very similar, except he didn't leave the room. He just would tune you out. And normal social conversation was simply not anything that interested him. Well, I had another list of folks. In the process of developing this documentary, we've begun to make an accounting of who got punished and who didn't. And it's a very interesting comparison, and I think in the documentary we'll develop this more. As far as Richard Nixon is concerned, I think he got all the symbolic punishment that it was possible to levy. The only man ever to be driven out of the presidency. And his regeneration of his career, or his acceptance by the American people, is quite an extraordinary exercise, which I think had a rather short span and probably ended with his death. Now tapes are going to come out and other material, and he's going to be back in the soup again. But from personal experience, I would say that it doesn't do much good to put anybody in jail unless it's somebody who is a hazard to the health and well-being of the rest of the population. Jail is a very feeble form of sanction. And so I would say probably the punishment fit the crime in his case much better than locking him up someplace. Besides, the process of convicting him and imprisoning him would have gridlocked the federal government. I think one of the people that we owe thanks to is Jerry Ford for having pardoned him and cleared the decks and gotten that all behind the country so that it didn't impose the sort of catatonia on the White House and the other parts of the executive branch that would have occurred otherwise. The notion that we didn't pick a good person to be president goes much more to our system of selection than it does to the individual makeup of some individual in that continuum. I would say right now we're confronted with a very stark situation it's kind of an anomaly. The polls show Clinton far ahead, but he's not somebody that you would line up for a blind date with your daughter.
Will all those Republicans in the audience please stop clapping?
If you haven't read Primary Colors yet, go to your library and borrow it. It's well worth the read.
Whatever your Republican feelings about the present incumbent, it doesn't answer the question about Nixon. If
Well,
he was a man who was prepared to lie in the way that he was and misuse the office of the president,
then,
was it not right that he should go?
Then there is a process to get rid of a person like that. And the process does not involve a power play by some engine of government or some cabal. I'm just now, in the course of this documentary work, beginning to realize what a slippery slope I was really standing on during that time. And it didn't take much of a nudge to send us all flying, because the thing was lined up in such a way. We had a crowd of prosecutors who knew very well that their key witness had, in at least 12 very important ways, lied to the Senate committee. They didn't share that knowledge with the defendants, as I think the law required them to do. They were determined to get a conviction. The Washington Post was determined to get a conviction. There were a lot of people lined up to make sure that those of us who were convicted, by golly, were convicted. And that's the way that went. I think it would have been interesting to see an impeachment process just from a purely academic standpoint. I'm trying to write a novel right now about an impeachment, a fictional impeachment. And I can't help, as I go along, but think about how it might have been. And someday somebody may write a very interesting play on the impeachment of Richard Nixon that actually brings him to trial and puts on the witnesses and opens up some of these things that we've just been alluding to. My hunch is that he would be acquitted in an impeachment trial. But that's just a novelist's hunch at this point.
John Ehrlichman, as you say, there are many, many more things that need still to be uncovered. You've, I think, lifted the lid on some of them. And also Jim Hoogan. Thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.